this now. So you have the arm, and it's basically this slide just gives you an overarching idea of the thoracic aorta before we talk about the blood supply of the arm. So the thoracic aorta, so you have the thorax, you have the arch of the thoracic aorta, and on the left-hand side, it goes into the left common carotid and left subclavian, so under the clavicle. But on the right-hand side, it goes into the brachiocephalic trunk, then goes into the common carotid and subclavian. That's a key thing to realize, that the left and right side actually have different numbers of branches from the thoracic aorta, which is something I always forget. But the subclavian, this is how the thoracic aorta links the upper limb vasculature. The subclavian enters the axillary space, and this is when it becomes really funny. You have the axillary artery that gives branches to the shoulder as the subclavian and suprascapular artery. Then it's just the brachial artery. Then it just runs medially and anteriorly as the radial and ulnar artery of the forearm. Then you just have like a little circular kind of network of blood vessels here in the arm, and it's an arch, right? That kind of arch supplies the fingers. So that blood supply, axillary artery, then you have subclavian and suprascapular branches, then you have the brachial artery, then you have the radial and ulnar artery, right? It makes sense because it's kind of linking with the names of the structures it's going past. So axillary for arm, brachial for the like brachii muscles, biceps brachii, and then ulnar and radial. So here's more information, and it's not really, I think, as essential to go into all of these details, but because it was in your lecture content, or will be in your lecture content, I've put them here for you just in case. So you have axillary and subclavian artery branches that form anastomoses around the scapula. And these are just branches to be aware of, that you have the dorsal scapular, suprascapular, and the circumflex artery, which is kind of like a circular circumflex. I kind of think it's like a circular kind of artery. And these are short circuited across scapular fosses. So fosses in the scapula. So the only thing to be aware of is that if one is damaged, the scapula still receives blood supply, right? So it's just that idea that there's collateral supply for the scapula. So it's not as prone to being at risk of a lack of blood supply. The head and neck of humerus is just got a blood supply from the anterior and posterior humeral circumflex arteries. I kind of think of it as kind of like a necklace of arteries around the humerus, and I kind of, because a head and neck, so a necklace, so circumflex arteries. The anterior compartment of the arm is just the brachial artery, and the posterior compartment of the arm is a branch of the brachial, which is the profunda brachii. So profunda brachii and brachial artery. Boom. Humerus is supplied by the nutrient brachial artery, which is just the humeral nutrient brachial artery. And what is a blood supply that provides a fail-safe mechanism to the upper limb? It's the collateral arteries. So collateral, I think about collateral damage. It doesn't let that collateral damage occur. So you just have a list of these arteries: superior, inferior, ulnar, radial, and medial collateral arteries. All these do, all to be aware of, it forms an anastomotic network around the elbow joint. So it provides a fail-safe mechanism to upper limb. So if anything bad happens to your vasculature, you have a backup mechanism, so you don't get any, so that you're still getting blood supply. So head and neck of humerus, circumflex arteries, anterior, posterior. Anterior compartment of the arm, brachial. Posterior, profunda brachii. Humerus itself is the humeral nutrient brachial artery. That's the whole blood supply of the arm in those little few bullet points. Next slide, please. Elbow joint. So elbow has a great mobility, but mobility means that you're sacrificing stability. So to maintain the stability, you have ligaments. What three ligaments do you have? You have the ulnar collateral ligament, the radiocollateral ligament, and the radio-ulnar ligament. So the thing about this is that I've just put the key points about each ligament. So it makes sense because you have the elbow, you have the radius, you have the ulnar. So you're going to have a radio-ulnar ligament from the radial head and a radial notch supporting pronation and supination. And the radial notch, I think, is within, I always get confused, but we're going to see it on the next slide because I remember it's on one of the slides, about the radial head goes into the radial notch of the ulnar. And then the radial collateral ligament and the ulnar collateral, if you just remember collateral, then it's ulnar collateral, radial collateral, radial ulnar. And those are all the ligaments you need to be aware of for the elbow. So you have all these bands of the ulnar collateral ligament, but the anterior band is the most important for elbow stability. The radial collateral ligament is just a fan-like ligament that extends from the lateral epicondyle, and it just blends with the radial annular ligament. That's just an extra fact. It's just the idea that you don't need to rote learn this and just memorize, just appreciate it and enjoy it as you go. Next slide, please. Okay, so at the surface of the elbow, you have articulating surfaces, and it's kind of like the ligaments we just talked about, that the names are quite easy to remember. You have a humeroradial, humeroulnar, and proximal radioulnar. So proximal, close by, radioulnar. Then you have a humeroulnar, so a humeroulnar and a humeroradial and humeroulnar. So we talked about capitulum and the fossa of the we talked about the capitulum and the trochlea before, and we talked about that allowing flexion and extension. So it's just a revision of that. But the actual surface where this articulation happens is the humeroradial joint and surface, humeroulnar, and the proximal radioulnar. Between the two is that you have, like I said, it comes up. The articular head of the radius goes into the radial notch of the ulna. And those are all the kind of connections that occur at the elbow. And now we're transforming from the upper limb. We've gone shoulder, arm, elbow, and next slide, please. Okay, so we have important contents at the elbow, and just to be aware, you have the median nerve, the brachial artery and vein, and the biceps tendon. Okay? The cubital fossa is just a fossa, and it is a possibility that you have cubital tunnel syndrome as well. So cubital fossa, just to know, is a place that is good for catheter insertion, right? So you can put catheter in there. Ulnar nerve is posterior, right? We talked about ulnar nerve. So we have the radial nerve supplying here and here, but the ulnar nerve is here at the elbow, and that's what is responsible for the funny bone. So when you hit your elbow, don't just hit your elbow now to feel the funny bone, but if you hit your elbow and you're like, oh my God, and it feels like tingling and funny sensation, that's why it's called the funny bone. Which nerve is getting attacked, not attacked or hit? It's the ulnar nerve, okay? Irritation to the ulnar nerve because of that contact is causing that funny bone sensation. You can have entrapment of the ulnar nerve at the elbow, and that's called cubital tunnel syndrome. And it's funny because you have cubital tunnel syndrome here, but down here you'll have carpal tunnel syndrome, carpal kind of with the wrist, okay? Next slide, please. So we're going through a nice kind of flow, and we're going to talk about the forearm. So the forearm was really annoying for me to learn because you had so much muscles, so much information, right? So I've condensed it all into one slide here. Anterior, so we said musculocutaneous nerve for anterior arm. Then you have the radial. Anterior forearm is the median nerve, largely, but then you have some contribution from the ulnar nerve. So you have to be careful. Arteries are the ulnar and radial arteries, which is so it's good, ulnar and radial, so it's fine, because those are the two kind of bones, and then you have the arteries are just the same names, so it's easy to remember. Here's the confusing thing that always confused me. Muscles of the anterior forearm, you have 5 superficial, 3 deep, but in the posterior forearm, you have muscles that are 3 superficial and 5 deep. So these are the names that I've listed here, and the posterior forearm, they're also listed there, but I think their textbooks just went out of the slide, so it's fine. But the 5 superficial, they all originate from the medial epicondyle of the humerus, and these are the muscles, right? So you have the palmar ulnar, you have pronator teres, you have flexor carpi radialis, like this. You have palmaris longus, and if you just search up an image and go through these images, just looking at the muscles, it's just the idea that it's in just the 5 muscles can be summarized in this 3-line thing, and that it's not actually too overwhelming as much as you think, right? So palmaris longus, fun fact, is that it's actually absent in 14% of the population. So if they ask you that fact, it's quite interesting to know. Flexor carpi ulnaris. So we had flexor carpi radialis. Now we have flexor carpi ulnaris. So it's kind of on the 2 sides. The FCU, they do all these abbreviations. It's a good landmark because the ulnar nerve and artery actually lie to the radial side of the FCU. And deep to all of these, you have the flexor digitorum superficialis. Okay, 3 muscles in the anterior of the forearm are the deep ones. So you have flexor pollicis, pollicis is thumb, then you have digitum, digitorum, and then you have pronator quadratus. So you have these muscles that are 3 deep. So you have 5, 3. I want you to do that right now. 5, 3, 5, 3, 5, 3, 5, 3. Okay. Remember, so 5 superficial, 3 deep. It'll take time, but you guys just have to try and remember and learn the names of these muscles. The function of this anterior forearm is flexion of the forearm. It's anterior, so it's going to have to be flexion. But it's also pronation, and it contains extrinsic muscles for flexing the wrist and the digits. So if you have anterior, so extrinsic muscles, what it's saying is it's outside the region of interest. So you have your wrist, flexing your wrist is like this, flexing your digits are like this. So we talked about something, where's it gone? Flexor digitorum, the digits superficialis. That's in the anterior forearm, but it's reaching to your digits. So that's why it's an extrinsic muscle that is flexing the wrist and the digits, right? Then you have flexor carpi, ulnaris, and radialis, and those together are actually flexing the wrist. So extrinsic muscles, they're not in the hand, not in the wrist, but they're in the forearm, the anterior forearm, contributing to flexion. Boom. Posterior forearm. All of these muscles insert to the lateral epicondyle of the humerus. So you don't actually need to memorize all the muscles and then the insertion. Just memorize the common insertion of all the muscles. The innervation, we already said, radial nerve, okay? Radial nerve. Particularly, it's actually called the posterior interosseous nerve of the radial nerve, which is a branch. So the thing to remember is radial nerve. If you want to go extra, remember posterior interosseous nerve, you can. The interesting thing is that this is the only nerve in the posterior forearm compartment. So the thing is that the radial nerve kind of goes and gives a branch that goes downwards to become posterior. And that's how it supplies the posterior forearm of the compartment, even though it went past the lateral epicondyle and went to become anterior. So it's got kind of like a little secret agent branch, I like to call it, going down. Blood supply. Anyone know the blood supply of the posterior forearm compartment? Anyone want to hazard a guess? Shall I make that your homework? I'm going to ask you for next session, what is a posterior arm, forearm blood supply? Okay? Okay. Muscles, you have the opposite of the anterior. The posterior forearm, you have 3 superficial, 5 deep. So 5, 3, 3, 5. 5, 3, 3, 5. 5, 3, 3, 5. And when you do that, it's easy to remember. Because people were in the anatomy dissection room last year and they were like 5, 3, 5, 3. And they were like 3, 5, 3, 5. I had no clue what they were doing until I kind of condensed it into this and understood what they were talking about. You have superficial muscles, which is superficial on top, deep is within. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so supination and pronation of the forearm and the hands is an important thing to kind of understand. So supination, soup, you have a bowl of soup here, supination. Pronation, if you remember the whip, like watch me whip. So that's how I remember it. You whip like a pro. So that's pronation. And you have supination. So as the forearm moves from pronation to supination, the fibers change from relaxed to tense, again to relax in supination. So if you do it on yourself, you actually feel it. So go from pronation, supination, it feels relaxed, and then it feels tense again, and it's relaxed again in supination. It's really weird, and it actually feels really cool that actually you can feel it. The principal muscles of pronation are the following: pronator quadratus, which makes sense, and pronator teres. So these are the muscles that are easy to remember because it's 2 muscles, but they both have pronator in the name. So it's easier to remember. But you also have some contribution from flexor carpi radialis, which makes sense because if it's on this side and you're pronating, the contraction is, if you think about insertion and origin, when you search it up, it will make sense. Then you also have minor contribution from palmaris longus and brachioradialis. Main ones to remember is pronator quadratus, pronator teres, which makes sense because pronator is in the name. Then you have principal muscles of supination. We already did this. We had supinator, which is a muscle, which is easy to remember because supinator. But biceps brachii is the most important thing that you need for power. If you go like this, screwdriver action, you need biceps brachii. And if you go look in the mirror I did this last year, and now I do it literally every other day. But I'm like this in the mirror to try and remember. And you can see the biceps brachii really getting contracted, and you can see the tension and from the screwdriver action. Biceps brachii, yeah? Good. So that's supination and pronation. So head of the radius rotates during pronation and supination in a socket, which is created by the annular ligament. It's something to be aware of. Which muscle brings the forearm into mid position between supination and pronation? So mid position between supination and pronation like this is brachioradialis. And that is a very cool thing actually to learn. That's why when they're saying that you want to go and hit the gym, you want to target brachioradialis. That's why you do flexion like this, right? And that is targeting brachioradialis specifically, right? So brachioradialis, biceps brachii. So the thing is, if you go like this, if you flex your arm like this for me now, guys, if you try and do that, try and tense your biceps brachii. You can't do it. You can't do it. The thing that will be tense is your brachioradialis. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's some extra points that you don't really need to know, but it's just fun to understand. So in supination, you have a ball of soup, so you're holding it in seven. Biceps brachii can somewhat contribute to flexion. Wait, yeah, not somewhat, can contribute. Yeah, in supination, biceps brachii contributes to flexion. In pronation, biceps cannot contribute to flexion of the arm, or cannot contribute. And why is that? Because of the way it's insertion. The way it's inserted means it's kind of got like a structural block that means it can't flex in that position. Brachialis, and if you feel it on yourself, you can feel it, that it doesn't really tense as much as it does when it's supinated, which I find really cool. Brachialis is another muscle in the anterior arm, and that inserts on the ulnar bone, and the relative position does not change in supination and pronation. That's why brachialis can flex, but biceps doesn't flex, because it just inserts into the ulnar bone. The radial bone is the bone that kind of moves, not the ulnar bone. Radius, yeah. This happened last time. I said radius and ulnar so much that I forgot the term, and I kept saying radial bone. Just ignore me. Okay, so triceps, olecranon process of the ulnar, which I said before. Revision, we're revisiting it again. The triceps inserts onto that olecranon process of the ulnar, and that means it's in an unaffected position because it's on the ulnar again. I think biceps is on the radial tuberosity, which means that is why it can't really contribute during pronation, because the radius keeps moving during pronation and supination much more than the ulnar bone. Because brachialis and triceps are attached to the ulnar bone, that's why it's unaffected in changing its position during pronation and supination. So that means that it can actually contribute during pronation and supination. I said olecranon is prone to fracture because tricep can pull part of the olecranon off in a fracture. So that just blew my mind. That muscle is so powerful. It's 2/3 of your muscle mass, I think, of the arm. So it can pull off the olecranon. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we've got all the way down and we're going to the wrist. So in the tuition that I did before, like the teaching, I didn't reach the wrist and the hands. So I want to go through it for you guys if you didn't attend. So the wrist bones articulate at the wrist joint. So you have radius and carpal bones, and you have the scaphoid and lunate and triquetrium and the radiocarpal joint, but there's no joint with the ulna itself. So the thing about the wrist joint is that there's only articulation between the radius and the wrist bones. There's no articulation with the ulna, right? And if you think about it, I find that really cool, right? I find that really cool. And it's the reason this kind of, the ulna kind of attaches to the radius, and the radius attaches to the carpal bones. So the carpal bones that articulate at the wrist joint are the scaphoid, the lunate, and the triquetrium. The bones of the wrist, the bones of the hand, and the carpal bones is a whole image that you can just search up, and it just summarizes all the bones. But that's up to you guys to try and memorize, okay? So why is adduction, also known as ulnar deviation, of the hand greater than abduction? Because there's a radial styloid process. If you look, there's a bump on the radial side of your wrist, right? That bump means you can't abduct your wrist as much as you can. Oh, that almost hurt. You adduct, and you can see it on yourself. You can't abduct your wrist as much as you can do ulnar deviation. I'm showing you now, and it's just so cool that you have a radial styloid process preventing yourself from abducting. A radial styloid, so radial, right, and styloid is kind of, the process is kind of just like a bump. That's what it's called, the radial styloid process. Carpal bones that are involved with the joint at the wrist, I've said lunate, scaphoid, triquetrum. Just remember those: scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum. So LST. I don't know what that means, but LST. Just think of that. So just remember that the lunate and scaphoid facets of the radius accommodate these bones in the joint. Because it's the radius bone that's articulating at the wrist joint, that's the bone that's going to have the facets. And the thing is to remember that whenever you have a bone, you need to insert it into a little dip. So that's why you have facets. That's why you have fossils. That's why you have these little gaps. Then you have ligaments to stabilize all the joint. So the only thing I want you to take away from this is that the radius bone articulates at the wrist, and the three carpal bones that are within this joint are the scaphoid, lunate, and triquetrum. Beautiful. And that forms the radiocarpal joint. Next slide, please. Okay, so wrist movement. This is important. You have flexion, extension, abduction, adduction. Flexion, extension, abduction, adduction. Can you see my hand, Priyanka? I'll take that as a yes. Okay. Okay. So flexor carpi radialis, flexor carpi ulnar. I think of it as two kind of lines on this side of your arm. If they both pull together, you're going to flex like that. You have some contribution, palmaris longus and abductor pollicis longus. But the main thing to remember is carpi radialis on this side, carpi ulnaris. I just want to apologize because I forgot to explain something that I found so confusing. All these names are so annoying, right? But they actually, when you actually understand it, it makes sense. Flexor, carpi, wrist, and radialis, radius. Flexor, flexion, carpi, wrist. Carpi means wrist. That's why you have carpal bones, carpi, ulnaris, ulnar. So these two kind of, I think of them as strings, kind of pull your wrist and flex your wrist. Then you have extension. It's just the same thing, but on the back. You have extensor carpi, radialis, longus and brevis. There's two of them though. Longus and brevis. Long means long. Brevis, like brief. I think of it as being brief, so it's short. Then you have extensor carpi ulnaris. So you have two kind of lines going here that extend your wrist. Flexion and extensor. So you have flexor carpi radialis and ulnaris, flexion of the wrist, extensor carpi radialis, longus and brevis, extensor carpi ulnaris for extension. Then you have abduction. Now you have these two strings, one on the posterior, one on the anterior. You have these two strings on this right-hand side, on the radialis side. If they both contract, you can have abduction, right? All of that makes sense, and it just blows my mind. Flexor carpi radialis, extensor carpi radialis, longus and brevis. They're both on the radius side. So if they both flex, your arm, your wrist is going to abduct that way. Similarly, if you have the ulnaris side muscles contract, you're going to have adduction. So extensor carpi ulnaris, flexor carpi ulnaris, adduction. Understand the name, learn the name, but then understand the movements, and it becomes so much easier. Because when I learned this the first time, I was trying to memorize like a table of all of it. But I literally just had to learn the name, understand the name, visualize it, and it makes sense. And now that's all of your wrist movement done. Next slide, please. Okay, key structures near the wrist. This is something I really want you guys to understand. You have an anatomical snuff box, and you have tendons that border it. I'm pretty sure, if I'm not wrong, anatomical snuff box is like this bit, that bit. So you have, and that makes sense. So if you have a snuff box, it's kind of like that cigarette box, I kind of think, that people used to put their cigarettes in this kind of little container. If you look at it, I've always wondered, what is this little snuff box? Okay, so it makes sense what muscles are actually there. Why? It's on the posterior part of your arm, right? So you have an abduction of your thumb. Pollicis is thumb. I did not know this until too late, guys. Pollicis is just thumb. So you have abductor pollicis longus. So you have a muscle that's abducting the thumb, okay, and it's long, okay. You have extensor pollicis longus and brevis. So you have two muscles that are extending the thumb, okay, right, okay, that makes sense. Extending the thumb, and they're long and small. Okay, so then you have this anatomical snuff box. You have the abductor pollicis longus and the extensor pollicis longus and brevis forming the borders of it. And you know it's going to be the pollicis because that's where this snuff box is. It's on the thumb. You have some tendons going around and forming that border. And it makes sense because it has to be the extensor pollicis longus because it's on that posterior aspect, and that's where extension happens. The three muscles to remember is brachioradial or brachioradialis, extensor carpi radialis longus, and extensor carpi radialis brevis. Carpal tunnel. This is a key thing. At the elbow, what did we say? We said there was a tunnel syndrome. Does anyone remember? Cubital tunnel syndrome. Okay, boom. And now we have carpal tunnel. Cubital tunnel, elbow. Carpal tunnel, we have a little tunnel. Look at your wrist. It's a beautiful little tunnel. You have passages of cars, i.e. muscles, going through this. You have so many structures going through this little speedway that is your wrist. It's so beautiful. It's so cool. And you have all these structures. You have flexor digitorum, flexor digitorum. You have all the flexors of these fingers, superficialis, because you have 4 fingers. My mind was blown. My mind was blown when this made sense to me. Because you have 4 fingers, so you're going to have 4 flexor tendons. I was like, oh my God. It took me too long to understand it. So you have 4 flexor, and look, they're all going through your carpal tunnel, right? This region is your carpal tunnel. You have flexor palmaris longus, the muscle that I said just goes through the anterior forearm to the hand. And you have the median nerve. The median nerve is so important to remember. If anyone asks you what nerve goes through the carpal tunnel, you have the median nerve. And that can result in carpal tunnel syndrome and compression. And that is important to understand, that you have carpal tunnel syndrome is when you have compression of these muscles, maybe because they've enlarged, or you can have compression of the nerve, and that has a pathology associated with it. How does the ulnar nerve enter the hand? It just goes through something called the Guyon's canal. That's just something just to be aware of. Next slide, please. Okay, so fractures. So the fracture of the distal end of the radius. So if you have the distal end of the radius, it's a Colles fracture, which is a transverse fracture, and it often results in the break. Is often the result of falling on the outstretched hand. So that's a Colles fracture, distal part of the radius. What is often associated with the distal radial fracture is a dorsal angulation and impaction, which is basically it's a deformity of the hand that looks like a dinner fork. Scaphoid fracture. This is the most important thing to remember, because it's a question that is coming up in every exam that we have. Okay. Distal radial fracture. Scaphoid is the most common bone of the wrist bones that get fractured, and it's often following a fall on the outstretched hand, and it can be easily missed on the x-ray and misdiagnosed as sprained wrist. So just be careful that you're aware of this, but it can be picked up later on x-ray because of bone resorption. And what is a complication of a scaphoid fracture? Is scaphoid non-union. So basically the branch of the radial artery, the recurrent branch, is damaged when you fracture the bone on the outstretched hand. That means you have disrupted blood supply. So that means your nutrients or the cells needed for bone healing can't reach that region at the right time. So you have slow healing, and that's scaphoid non-union. Next slide, please. Okay, this is carpal tunnel syndrome. So what is carpal tunnel syndrome? It's basically, I've already mentioned this, which is perfect. So the inflammation of the muscles or any structure makes it bigger, the structures within the tunnel bigger, and that means that the tunnel's compressed, these muscle sheaths. So yeah, so you have reduction in free space that compresses the median nerve, that causes tingling, reduced or absent sensation, and that can actually lead to progressive loss of coordination and strength of the thumb, because the median supplies the APB and the opponent's pollicis. So that's why you can't really go like this in your hand when you have a carpal tunnel syndrome. So management is just carpal tunnel release. If you have compression from the carpal tunnel, you basically do something surgically to allow to relieve that pressure. So an incision is made. Okay, so we're going to talk about the hand, and I just want you to understand the overarching structure of the hand. So you have the thenar eminence, so that's kind of the thumb, and that includes the extensor pollicis brevis and the thenar muscles. The structure and layers, you have the thenar and hypothenar, then within you have adductor pollicis on its own, then within that you have the INTEROSSEI and the lumbricals. The lumbricals are important for like pen and holding a pen. So thenar muscles and innervation, you have the thenar muscles all listed here. So you have all of those there, and they are supplied by the recurrent branch of the median nerve. That's why when you have carpal tunnel syndrome and you have pathology of the median nerve, that's why you kind of lose that ability to go like this. Hypothenar muscles, so thumb, we talked about thenar muscles, hypothenar muscles, below the thenar muscles is that you have innervation. You have these muscles listed here, but they are innervated by the ulnar. So I said that usually it's median nerve. over here, but you do have some contribution from the ulnar nerve, and that's the hypothenar muscles. And then you have the adductor pollicis, which is deep to the thenar muscles, and that is also innervated by ulna. Abductor pollicis allows you to adduct your thumb, which makes sense because adductor, adduction, pollicis, thumb, and that allows you to provide a grip, right? Lumbricals flex the digits at the metacarpal joints, and that extends the interphalangeal joints as well. So they place the fingers in the writing position. So it's important for writing. I just think of lumbricals. That's the only thing I remember, that writing position, lumbricals. So you have creases on your digits like this. If you literally can see the creases. On a digital palmar crease, does not overlie a joint, right? That's the only thing to be aware of. That in these creases, the crease that doesn't overlie a joint is the digital palmar crease, and because does not overlie a joint, because the metacarpal phalangeal joint is actually more proximal to where the crease is compared to the crease. What is present to prevent the bowing of the tendons in the hand? You have structural sheaths that keep the tendons in place, and these are the annular and cruciate fibrous digital sheaths that prevent bowing of tendons in the hand. Next slide, please. Okay, so dorsal and palmar interossei. Here's just another thing that is very key, is dab and pad. The functions and numbers of the dorsal and palmar interossei in the hand both assist the lumbricals to flex the metacarpal phalangeal joints. So dab, you have 4 of them, and then you have pad, you have 3 of them. So you have dorsal, that the dorsal abduct. So dorsal abduct, dab. So they abduct the 2nd and 4th digits, because you have 2 on the middle finger. You already have abductors of the, you have 4 of them because they abduct the 2nd and 4th digit. You have 2 on the middle finger to allow you, because imagine the middle finger is kind of the medial line of the axis of abduction, adduction of the fingers. So you have 2 here to go like this, like that. Then you have 1 to go here, and then 1 to go there. So that's the 4 abduction muscles of the hand. Those are the interossei. You already have known muscles for abduction of the thumb and the pinky in the thenar and hypothenar group anyway. So that's why you only have 4 dorsal interossei that abduct the 2nd and 4th digits, because the thumb and pinky already have their own muscles. Pad, you have 3 of them. Palmar, they adduct the 2nd, 4th, and 5th digits. The thumb already has its own adductor pollicis, and the middle finger has 2 abductors. So middle finger, we said, has 2 abductors. So abduction in the opposite direction is technically adduction. So that means you can literally pull the finger in the opposite direction using abductors, and that's basically equivalent to adduction. So that's why you only have 3 pads, and you have 4 dorsal interossei and 3 palmar interossei. Next slide, please. Okay, so here is the hand innervation. So you have median and ulnar nerves basically supply all the motor innervation to the hand. The median nerve, we said, goes through the carpal tunnel, is motor to the 3 short thenar muscles, the 1st and 2nd lumbricals. This is basically just stuff you need to try and memorize. The ulnar nerve goes through the Guyon canal between the 2 bones, the hamate and pisiform bones. They send motor fibers to the hypothenar muscles, we said before, and the ulnar 2 lumbricals for the 4th and 5th digits, adductor pollicis, and all the interosseous muscles. All the interosseous muscles are supplied by the ulnar nerve. The radial nerve actually sends sensory branches to the dorsal aspect. There's no motor branches to the intrinsic hand muscle. So the radial nerve has no motor branches, meaning it doesn't actually contribute to contraction, it contributes to sensation and sensory input. There are no intrinsic muscles in the posterior compartment of the hand. Just remember that. Next slide, please. Okay. Blood supply and venous drainage of the hand. We're almost there. What is the blood supply and venous drainage of the hand? You have the ulnar and radial arteries. They anastomose to form deep palmar arches. Superficial and deep palmar arches just look like this. And actually, in the absence of a vascular disease, either artery is alone sufficient to perfuse the entire hand itself. I found that so amazing. The venous drainage of the hand, the anterior compartment, superficial and deep vena palmar arches, just like the superficial and deep palmar arterial arches, you have venous palmar arches. And the posterior compartment has no intrinsic muscles, so it doesn't really need a venous blood supply of venous drainage.